Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us online as we continue our summer series called Incredible Journey. In this series, we are looking at this journey that we call life. It's an incredible journey that all of us are on. It's a journey that brought all of us here together today, and it's a journey in which we seek to have wisdom and know how to move forward. And there are seasons of our journey. There are moments in our journey where things are going well. There's other moments in our journey where things are a little bit more rocky. And we're taking this summer to look at the Psalms. And we're looking at the Psalms to find godly wisdom for how we navigate this thing called life. Now, in this, as I said, we're looking at the Psalms to find wisdom. We're also looking at faithful historic Christians who have demonstrated the principle in the Psalm that we're looking at through their life. And we're doing that again so that we can learn how to navigate our own life. And today we are looking at the Psalm 34, and we're also going to be looking at the life of a man named Cyprian who lived several hundred years ago. And the topic for today is fear. We're going to be talking about fear. Now, I don't know what that does for you when I say, hey, let's talk about our fears. Maybe it makes you a little bit afraid. Maybe your fear is talking about fear. So I don't know what that elicits in you, but I think there's all kinds of different fears, right? There's healthy fears. There's fears that are healthy, that are helpful, and there's unhealthy fears. Healthy fears are helpful. Unhealthy fears are damaging. Now, we're not just going to be talking about any kind of fear. We'll also be talking about the fear of God. I know it's just getting better and better as we go along. But healthy fear, unhealthy fear, we navigate these things in our journey called life. And recently I've found myself helping my kids navigate fear. I don't know about you, but this summer, I looked at my schedule at the beginning of the summer and I thought, man, who put all of these things on my to-do list? Who put all of these things in my calendar? And as I pondered that question, I realized it was actually me. My wife and I, Brandy, we have an anniversary in the summer. We also have 4 kids, 12, 11, 8, and 4. And so this summer has been full of celebration. This summer has been full of busyness with our kids, camping trips and different vacations and opportunities to gather together as family. And recently we were on one of these camping trips at a lake in Central Oregon. And we were staying in this old rustic cabin, kind of crammed in this tight space. It was our summer vacation. It was kind of the middle of June. And on this vacation, we found ourselves in the midst of just about every type of weather system you could think of. So we showed up on Monday, and when we showed up, it was raining, which is just what you want on your summer vacation. The next morning, we woke up hoping that weather would be better, but we woke up to snow falling on the tops of the mountains that were surrounding us, and even falling down on the lake where we were. It didn't stick, it didn't stay on the ground, but it was definitely cold. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, it was 84 degrees out, and we were in the water just having a blast. There was only one type of weather that we were missing on this vacation, and we ran into that type of weather Thursday afternoon. Again, we were in the lake, we were having a blast. All 4 kids are out on their kayaks or a paddleboard. We're just hanging out. My wife, Brandy, and I look up in the sky and we see the dark black cloud rolling in, and we knew exactly what was about to happen, and pretty soon we started to hear it. It was thunder and it was lightning. So we gathered the kids, we went back to the cabin, and I don't know what your family does when you hear thunder and lightning. Maybe you go and you hide under the bed, maybe you close the curtains, maybe it terrifies you, maybe one of your greatest fears is thunder and lightning. But for us, we love to just gather around a window, crack it so we can hear what's going on, and we just watch for the flashes of lightning. We do the count to 1 or 2 or 3 and see how many miles away it is. And so we're at the cabin, it's raining, thunder and lightning is happening. We're gathered at the window, we're playing cards, we're enjoying this storm. And pretty soon, before you know it, my boys, my 2 oldest, my 12 and 11-year-old, they turn to me and they go, "Dad, we've got the greatest idea." To which I'm like, this ought to be good. They look at me and they go, "Dad, what if we got in our kayaks, we paddled to the middle of the lake, and we watched the thunderstorm from there?" Now, that would be cool, but that would be incredibly unsafe. And it was that moment where I realized my boys need a healthy fear of thunder and lightning. Like, they don't understand the power behind this storm. They don't understand that being out in the middle of the lake, raising your paddle high in the air, is the worst place you can be when you're encountering a storm like this. And yet, it's the awesomeness, it's the beauty, it is the very power of the storm that causes our family to gather at the window, to watch, to listen, to partake, and kind of enjoy. We watch in awe of this thing that's happening, but we engage with it in specific ways. We engage with it in healthy ways, not in unhealthy ways. For us to go out in the middle of the lake during a thunderstorm is not safe. For us to watch from the window is enjoyable, and it's exciting, and it's awe-inspiring. But my kids, they needed to be taught a healthy fear of the power and awesomeness of this thunderstorm. Now, again, as I said, healthy fear is helpful. It protects us, it guides us, it leads us, it keeps us on the right path and heading in the right direction. On the contrary, unhealthy fear can be incredibly damaging. Now, the older I get, kind of the less I'm afraid of physical harm or bodily harm. Like, heights don't really scare me. Thunderstorms don't really scare me. Driving on the highway and the risk of maybe getting in an accident, I don't really find myself being concerned with that. But my fears are actually more wrapped up in maybe less tangible things. They're wrapped up more in relationship. And as I was preparing for this message, I was thinking to myself, like, if I'm going to talk about fear, what is my greatest fear? And if you'll give me the permission to just be a little bit vulnerable, my wife confirmed this fear, by the way. My greatest fear, I think, is that someone wouldn't like me. Like, my greatest fear is being rejected. My greatest fear is that I would say something or do something or interact with somebody in a way that would cause them to not enjoy being around me, to not value my presence in their life. My greatest fear is that someone would distance themselves from me because of who I am. And if I don't manage that unhealthy fear well, I can function in a really unhealthy way. If I don't manage this fear of wanting to be liked, I can become an unhelpful husband to my wife. If I get so wrapped up in whether or not my kids like me, I can forget to be a father to my children because I'm more concerned about what they think about me. I fail to lead. I fail to serve. I fail to love in the way that God's called me to do all of those things because I'm giving into my greatest fear. Now, on the flip side of that fear is the reality that when I can circumnavigate that fear, when I can avoid that fear becoming a reality, I also find a deep sense, a deep feeling of security. So my greatest fear is really wrapped up in what makes me feel secure. My greatest fear is wrapped up in losing what makes me feel secure. And the problem with that is that even if someone says they like me, which makes me feel safe, it makes me feel secure. If someone is affirming me, it makes me feel good. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, but if all of my being is wrapped up in that, then I'm not actually secure at all. It's a false sense of security because just as easily as someone could affirm who I am, someone could tear down who I am. And if all of my hope, if all of my security is found in not losing that one thing, then it's a false sense of security because it can be removed from me in an instant. So as you begin to think about fear for yourself, what is your greatest fear? What do you fear losing most? Or maybe a better, more revealing, harder question to answer is what makes you feel the most secure? And how afraid are you of losing that thing? Maybe you find your security, or maybe what you're afraid of losing most is the balance in your bank account, the finances that you have at your disposal. How much money is in your account? How much equity is in your home? How much your retirement account has gained or lost? Maybe you find your security in your financial status. Maybe your security is found in your health. Maybe what you fear most is to lose health, or to lose the stamina in your body, or maybe what you fear most, losing most, is your career, or the status that your degree gives you in a certain field or in a certain profession. Maybe you find the most security in the status or influence that you have in your neighborhood, or maybe the home that you own, or the cul-de-sac you live in. Maybe your security is found in the place that you live because of which school district it allows your kids to go to. Where is your security most deeply found? And how afraid are you to lose that security? See, often our security is found in mitigating losing our greatest fear, or not having to face our greatest fear. And the reality is that when we find our security in these temporary things that can be lost in a moment, we might feel secure, but it's a false sense of security, and it's only temporary. And the deepest desire of our heart is not to feel secure temporarily, but to actually find security forever. Now, the reality is, as we go on our journey through life, we will experience moments in time where things will be ripped out from underneath us. And that's where we get introduced to this guy named Cyprian. Cyprian lived quite a long time ago. He was a bishop in a region of Africa, and he had many of the things that we might find security in ripped from his grip over and over again, time and time again. If you were to look at his life, you would see this winding path of unpredictable circumstances and events. In fact, let's actually take a look at a timeline of Cyprian's life. This is just a brief portion of his life. In the year 246, as I said, he lived a while ago, he was converted to Christianity. He gave his life to Jesus. He became a follower of Jesus in 246. Just 2 years after he became a follower of Jesus, he became a bishop. He became a leader in the church in Africa, in Carthage, where he lived. And a year after he became bishop, a year after he became the leader of the church in his city, he was exiled. He was kicked out of the city as a bishop because of what he believed. A new Roman emperor came into power and launched a persecution against the church and against Christians. And so Cyprian was kicked out of Carthage, only to come back 2 years later when that emperor died. He was able to come back and return as the bishop of Carthage. But just a year later, a plague hit. And so people begin to lose their health and lose their security in their future, and they begin to ask all kinds of questions. And it was just a year after the plague hit that another Roman emperor came into power and continued the same persecution that began in 249 against Christians and against Cyprian. So he was asked to leave the city. He had to run for his life, but instead of leaving the city, he actually hid in the city for a number of years. And in the midst of his hiding, he also ended up facing division in the church over some doctrine about baptism. That's a whole nother conversation. But Cyprian is navigating a plague, persecution, exile, church division, when at last in 258, he's found where he's hiding and killed for being a follower of Jesus. This is Cyprian's life. This is the chaos of his life. Every moment where he may have been able to cling to something as security for himself, that very thing was ripped away from him. He had to find his security somewhere else. And in the midst of this chaotic life, we have a number of writings from him, because when he was exiled, he was leading the church by writing back to his church. And let's just take a look at a few of the things that he wrote in the midst of all of this. Look at this first quote. Cyprian says, "Those who exclude the poor from their neighborhood, they stretch out their fields far and wide into space without limits." In other words, anybody who's trying to gain more in the midst of chaos, anyone who's trying to gain more, even in the midst of their riches, even in the midst of all that they have, those very things are torn to pieces by the anxiety of vague thought, the anxiety, the fear that the robber might spoil what they have. this fear that the murderer might attack and take their life, this fear that the envy of some wealthier neighbor should become hostile and harass them with malicious lawsuits. Cyprian says such somebody who's gained all of these things enjoys no security. They enjoy no security either in his food or in his sleep. Someone who has all of this stuff amassed for the purpose of finding security in these things can't even find security in the fact that they have food every day and a pillow to lay their head on every night. In other words, Cyprian is saying our stuff doesn't provide us with security. Our things don't give us this lasting security that we deeply desire. Remember that Cyprian had watched a city be torn apart by plague, by division, by persecution. And he's saying, whatever you do not cling to things that are temporary because they won't provide you with the security you hope they provide you with. He goes on to say this in another writing. He says, a solid and firm and constant security is to be anchored on the ground of the harbor of eternal salvation. In other words, we need something eternal, something everlasting to put our security in. The only solid and firm security is found in our salvation that comes through Jesus. And he says, may we lift our eyes from the temporary things of earth to the eternal things of heaven. Cyprian is trying to get us to understand that it's not us who guarantees our lot or our future. It's actually God who secures our lot. He's our security. Nothing on earth can fill the void that is in our hearts. The thing that we long for is security eternally. So Cyprian warns against being tied to temporary things, right? He also warns against what being tied to temporary things will do to our soul. This is the last quote from him. Look at what he says. He says, their property, the stuff they had, the things that they had amassed, held them in chains. Look at this language. Chains which shackled their courage, which choked their faith and hampered their judgment. These chains throttled their soul. If they stored up their treasure in heaven, they would not now have an enemy and thief within their own household. They think of themselves as owners, whereas it is they rather who are owned. Enslaved as they are to their own property, they are not the masters of their money, but instead they are its slaves. We can become enslaved to our stuff. We can become enslaved to what we've amassed. And when we're enslaved, we fear losing what we're enslaved to. Now, as I said at the beginning, this series, it's not a series on church history or historical people, although we're using them as guides and trying to learn from their wisdom. This is a series on the Psalms. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to look at Psalm 34. And Psalm 34 was written by David, and it actually speaks to this idea of fear and the fear of losing what we can physically cling to. And like Cyprian, David's life was actually pretty chaotic as well. David's life was one that was filled with all kinds of unexpected twists and turns. He had much to fear. And if we just take a look at even what David experienced through a portion of his life, we see that about 13 or 14 years old, David was anointed to be the future king. King Saul was the current king, but he was anointed to be the next king. Just a little bit later, David's brothers are on the front lines fighting with Israel against the Philistines. And David's dad sends David to the front lines to bring a cheese pizza, really, to his brothers for a snack. And so David shows up, and it's at that point right there where Goliath is challenging the nation of Israel. And every soldier in the nation of Israel is afraid of Goliath, but David shows up without fear, unafraid. And so King Saul says, David, why don't you go fight Goliath? He goes out, he fights Goliath, defeats him. And Saul goes, man, this kid is awesome. I like David. And I hear he's a pretty good guitar player. So Saul invites David into his court to play guitar for Saul whenever Saul is feeling afraid or fearing whatever's next. But Saul begins to recognize that David is actually he's a pretty good leader. And Saul starts to get envious of David and even feels as if David is going to take the throne from Saul. So while David's sitting there playing guitar, Saul reaches over, grabs a spear, throws it at David, misses. David runs in fear of Saul to try and escape Saul coming after him, only to run into King Achish in another region, another super powerful king. And because of David's experience and fear of Saul, he recognizes that King Achish could also become jealous of David. So David's now not only running from Saul in fear, he's running from King Achish in fear. And he finds himself exiled out in the wilderness, in the middle of a cave, hiding, trying to take refuge in this cave. And it's in this state, after all of this, exiled in a cave, where David pens or he quills or whatever they used to write back then, Psalm 34. And you may recognize some of Psalm 34, but we're going to start by looking at verse 4, where David says this. He says, I sought the Lord. I pursued God. One translation says, I prayed to the Lord. David says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. And David says, he delivered me from all my fears. Now, this verse has been great for my kids when they wake up in the middle of the night and they've had a nightmare, and we get to remind them that God is always present and that even when we're afraid, God can free us from those kinds of fears. And that's cute and true and very helpful. But when we recognize what scenario this was written in, David had much to fear. David was not afraid of hypothetical ideas out there. He was afraid for his life. And yet he says, when I brought my fears to the Lord, not only did he answer me, but he freed me. He delivered me, not from some, but from all my fears. And David continues to talk through this. We're going to jump down to verse 8, where David says, maybe you're familiar with this too, taste and see that the Lord is good. Now, if you're not familiar with this, that sounds a little bit weird. We're going to taste God? Like, what do you mean? Well, we've got to remember that Psalms, they're poems. It's poetry. David is trying to elicit thoughts and imagery in our head. David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. In other words, if you've never brought your fears to God, if you've never sought the Lord, if you've never prayed to God, if you've never brought your whole self to God, taste, try it, and find, you will see when you try it that the Lord is good. He says, oh, the joys of those who take refuge, not in a cave in the middle of the wilderness, although that's where David is, but oh, the joys of those who hide in the Lord. And then he confuses me with this next line, where he says, fear the Lord, you his godly people. The reason this is confusing for me is because just a couple verses earlier, David said, when you come to the Lord, he'll free you from your fears. And now David is saying, actually, fear the Lord. Hide in him, take refuge in him, find that he's good, but be afraid of the Lord, you his godly people. For those who fear him will have all they need. There's got to be more to this. David, there's got to be more to this idea that we need to fear the very person that you're telling us to take refuge in. And there is more. Luckily, David continues. Verse 10, he says, even strong young lions sometimes go hungry. That clears the whole thing up. Thank you so much. No, why is David now talking about lions? Well, who are lions? In the animal kingdom, what's a lion? It's the king of the jungle. The lion is the pinnacle of the food chain. We know better now, but this is the picture that David is painting. Remember, he's stirring up imagery for us. He's saying even the king of the jungle, even the king of the animal kingdom sometimes goes hungry. David is anointed king. He's on the run from two other kings. And arguably, a king in this day and age is the most powerful person on the planet. They have access to every type of protection, every type of possession. And David is saying, even the most powerful, Even the ones who have the most access to the most stuff sometimes have a hunger deep within their soul for something they don't have. But, he says, those who trust in the Lord, they will lack no good thing. He says, come, my children, and listen to me, and I will teach you to fear the Lord. I will teach you to fear the Lord. There it is again. Now, again, as I said, in some ways this is confusing. Will God free us from all our fears, or are we called to fear him? And the answer is yes. But the English language, fear, is a pretty simple word, isn't it? I mean, to fear something is to be afraid of it. But in the original language that this was written in, which is Hebrew, the word fear has a huge, vast array of meanings. It's used to describe all kinds of things, which means those who translated the Hebrew back into English, they translate it differently in some different contexts. And this Hebrew word is not only used to talk about being terrified of something, it's also used to talk about revering something, having deep reverence, honor, and respect. This is a little bit different. It's not just being filled with terror. It's understanding the power and the awesomeness of something and having honor and respect and holding it high. In fact, this word is even used, sometimes it's even translated as awesome. And perhaps the most clarifying translation that's used is when this same word is translated as worship. It's to hold in the highest regard, to worship above all else. It's not just to be filled with terror, it's to be filled with reverence, with awe, and with worship. David feared God. He revered God. He worshiped God because of God's awesomeness, because of God's whole entire character, because of who God is. David feared God. But more than that, David revered God more than he feared the king. David wrote this in the very cave where he would spare Saul's life. And he spared Saul's life for that very reason, because he revered God more than he feared the king. And I know, like, sometimes we can come to God and we can be filled with terror. I know that that's a reality for many of us. And I even struggled to use that illustration of healthy fear at the beginning. I was like, man, should I use lightning? I've been a pastor for quite a while now, and every now and then when someone asks me what I do for a living, and I say pastor, sometimes that elicits some really cool, interesting conversations. Other times, the conversation's over at that moment. They're like, "Oh, you're a pastor, cool, all right." But oftentimes I'll run into people who go, "Oh, that's really interesting. You know, I used to go to church, or I grew up in church, or I haven't been in a while," and they'll say something along the lines of, "If I ever go back, like I just know the building's gonna get struck by lightning or something. Like if I walk into a church, if I walk into the presence of God, lightning's gonna strike me on the spot." To which I always let them know that if that was gonna happen, it would have happened to me already. So I had this hesitation to use lightning, but I think it's appropriate in so many ways, because it's the awesomeness, it's the power, it's the beauty that comes with lightning that makes it so awesome, that makes it intriguing, that makes it inspiring. And how we engage with lightning is so incredibly important. If we don't understand the wholeness of it, we will engage with it inappropriately. And I think there's times in our life where we view God in bits and pieces and parts of who he is. And we forget that there's an entire character of God. There's this gamut of who God is and how he's chosen to relate to us. But because of how we grew up, or because of the way that people have talked about God, we see him in bits and pieces of who he is. We relate to him in parts rather than in whole. And just to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to throw this pie chart up. And this pie chart, you probably know how that works, right? The whole thing, these are pieces. And each piece of the pie is actually, it's a character trait. It's a characteristic of God. It's a name or a character trait that's used, that's attributed to God in Scripture. And this isn't even all of them. This is just a few of them. But I don't know about you, but maybe as you read some of these, you can recognize, yeah, that's how I relate to God. And some of these can instill terror in us. Maybe for you, you think of God as Father, and that's actually maybe a little bit, that makes you a little bit timid to approach God because you were timid to approach your Father. You think of God as Father, and it elicits a little bit of skepticism or even fear because your dad you feared him. Or maybe you look at God and you see, God as master. You're familiar with that, but you've never seen a master do anything but leverage their power to oppress other people. Or maybe you think of God as mighty, that he's big and he's strong and he's loud, and you think, yeah, that's terrifying to me. Or maybe for you, you think of God as the God who sees, and you think, does he see everything? Does he see it all? He sees what I say, what I do, what I think, what I did 10 years ago, what I did just the other day. He sees all of it. That's terrifying. I'm afraid of God. And if we relate to God in just bits and pieces and we miss the whole, then we may engage with God in all his might and all his power in a way that isn't connecting with the whole person of who he is. But when we zoom out, when we taste and see, when we seek God and we begin to get a fuller picture of who he is as revealed to us in Scripture, we begin to see that, yes, he is God the Father. But he's not just God the Father, he's God with us. He's a Father who will never leave us, will never forsake us. He's a Father who's drawn near and has been near from the very beginning, is near now, and will not leave at any point in the future. When we engage with the wholeness of who God is, we see that he is master, he is ruler, he is the last word, he's in charge. But he's a master that comes to build a kingdom of peace. That he's a master who has come and demonstrated peace by sending his son to build a kingdom marked by peace and marked by justice. When we approach the wholeness of who God is, yes, he is absolutely mighty, but he's also a provider. And so in our greatest times of need, we can trust him and know that he will mightily provide for everything that we need. And when we approach God in all of his wholeness, yes, he is the God who sees all, who knows all, who sees the condition of my heart and yours, and yet he's the Lord who saves. That in the seeing, in the understanding of all things, he's not withdrawing from you. He's drawing near toward you. That there's nothing he can see or know or understand about you or I that would cause him to stiff arm us. No, in fact, he's the Lord who sees all and steps into the chaos of our life for the purpose of redeeming, restoring, saving, and coming alongside. So yes, we fear God because he's mighty and he's powerful. And we revere God because we know that he's with us, that he's for us, and that ultimately he can be trusted and that he is good. We revere God by putting him first above all else. And we revere God in the same way that David did, knowing that when we worship God at the top of all other things, that all of these fears of temporary things fade in comparison to the wholeness of God's character. And so as we close, I just want to close with this reminder. The words of David, Psalm 34, verse 8, where David says this. He says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, the joys of those who take refuge, who hide in him. Fear the Lord, revere him, honor him, worship him, you his godly people. For those who do that, they will have all that they need." Let me pray. God, we thank you that you do not come to us in bits and pieces. God, that you do not come to us as just a master or just mighty or just one who knows all and sees all. But God, you come to us in your wholeness. God, that you come to build peace into our lives, that you come to be a place where we can take refuge from all the other things that we experience in this life. And so, God, I pray that as we are on our journey, as we're going through our life, and we hit these moments where we feel our security blanket is torn off, God, may we run to you. May we hide in you. And God, today, may we even preemptively come and take refuge in you. May we taste and see your goodness. May we fear you. May we revere you. And may we worship you alone. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope that as you go about your week, as fears stir up in your heart, as you find yourself finding security in things that can be stripped away, may our hearts turn towards the God who's with us, who's present, and may we approach him in his wholeness, not just in parts. Love you guys. We'll see you soon.